Your grandfather hates you, my stepmother repeated, forcing me to work 2 jobs since I was 16 just to buy food. Years later, that same grandfather found me in a refugee camp after the storm. His face went pale when he realized the $3 million he had sent for my life had turned into a mansion and luxury cars for my stepmother, while I was wearing rags from donation bins. My name is Clara Marlowe, and this was the moment my entire world shifted on its axis. It was another sweltering, heavy afternoon at a relief center in Houston. Weeks after the hurricane had torn through the coast, I was still there, handing out water and supplies to families who had lost everything. I was wearing the same worn jeans and a donated t-shirt I'd been living in since the water rose. Then I saw him, an older man in a tailored suit walking straight toward me. He looked entirely out of place among the canvas tents and folding tables. At first, he didn't say a word, he just stood there, staring at me as if he were looking at a ghost. Finally, he pulled me away from the crowd and asked in a low, trembling voice, "Have you ever received any support from your grandfather?" I froze. No one had ever mentioned a grandfather, let alone one who sent money. The woman who raised me after my parents passed had always insisted he wanted nothing to do with me, that he blamed me for the complications that took my mother's life. I told him the truth, I hadn't seen a single cent. His face went pale, as if I'd just confirmed his worst fears. That one question changed everything. Somewhere out there, a $3 million trust fund established in my name had vanished, and I was about to find out who had taken it. To understand why this man had traveled all the way from Colorado just to find me, you have to go back to the office where it all began. Arthur Marlowe sat alone in his corner suite on the 60th floor of a glass tower in downtown Denver. The jagged peaks of the Rockies stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed the view. In his hands was a thin manila folder delivered that morning by a private investigator he had hired on a nagging hunch. He opened it slowly. Past the background checks were the photographs. The young woman in the images had warm skin, and thick dark hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She wore faded clothes and a plain gray shirt with the logo of a local charity. In one shot, she was handing a bottle of water to an elderly man on a cot. In another, she was organizing crates of clothing. Her face showed bone-deep exhaustion, but there was a quiet, familiar determination in her eyes that made Arthur's chest tighten. Clara Marlowe. His granddaughter. The investigator's summary was blunt. After the hurricane hammered the Texas coast, Clara had been living and working in a temporary shelter near Houston. She wasn't just a visitor, she was a resident. The report noted she had no personal assets, no active bank accounts, and no property in her name. Meanwhile, the family home in an affluent suburb had already been repaired and reoccupied by her legal guardian, Beatrice Thorne, and Beatrice's younger daughter, Chloe. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, the folder resting on the heavy mahogany desk. He had always assumed the trust he established 19 years ago was being used as intended. $10,000 had been deposited every month without fail, totaling well over $3 million by now. The account was in Clara's name, but as her guardian after Julian's death, Beatrice had full authority to withdraw funds for her upbringing, education, and medical care. The lawyers had assured him the arrangement was standard. Arthur had signed the papers in a fog of grief shortly after his daughter, Eleanor, died during childbirth. At the time, the prospect of raising a newborn while managing a global real estate empire felt impossible. When Julian remarried a few years later and Beatrice gave birth to Chloe, it seemed like the perfect solution, a stable home with a new family. Arthur rubbed his temples. He had never insisted on detailed audits. A brief email or a holiday card from Beatrice every year had been enough to ease his conscience. She always wrote that Clara was doing well, focusing on her studies, and adjusting to life. He had believed her because believing was easier than facing the truth. Now the photographs told a different story, a 19-year-old woman sleeping on a cot in a gymnasium. No designer clothes, no car, no sign of the security he thought he had provided. He picked up his phone and dialed the investigator. Tell me again why she's still there, Arthur said, skipping the pleasantries. The investigator's voice was professional and detached. The guardian's residence was repaired weeks ago using insurance funds. The younger daughter moved back in immediately. Clara chose to stay at the shelter to help with relief efforts. She told the staff she's used to making her own way. Arthur's grip tightened on the handset. Chose to stay, or wasn't given a choice? That's harder to confirm without direct access, the man replied. Everything looks clean on paper. No police reports, no formal complaints. Arthur thanked him and hung up. He opened the folder again, flipping to the bank records. The deposits were all there, monthly, automatic, never missed. But there were no receipts, no statements showing how the money was actually spent. He had trusted the language of the law, and he had trusted Beatrice. He stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. He thought of Eleanor, her laugh, her stubborn refusal to take the easy path. She had married Julian Thorne, a man with modest dreams and a steady heart. Then the accident took Julian when Clara was 15. Arthur had sent flowers, increased the monthly deposit, and accepted Beatrice's assurances that everything was under control. Now doubt crept in like a cold draft. Why was there no college fund? Why was she wearing donated clothes? Arthur returned to his desk and booked the earliest flight to Houston. He packed a slim selection of the trust documents and transfer confirmations, nothing too aggressive, just enough to start a conversation. As the car took him through the Denver traffic toward the airport, Arthur looked at the photos one last time. Clara's smile in one image reminded him painfully of Eleanor at the same age. He had missed so much already. Whatever the truth was, he needed to hear it directly from her. Arthur had never pressed for line-item reports. A brief update or a Christmas card from Beatrice Thorne once a year had been enough to soothe his conscience. She always painted a picture of Clara thriving, doing well in school, finding her footing. He had clung to those words because the alternative was too painful to contemplate. But the photographs in front of him shattered that illusion. There she was, a 19-year-old woman, his own flesh and blood, sleeping on a thin cot in a gymnasium-turned-shelter. No designer labels, no vehicle in her name, none of the comfort his millions should have guaranteed. He reached for his phone and dialed Thomas Reed, a former Denver detective who now handled high-stakes corporate investigations. Tell me again why she hasn't left, Arthur said, the greeting forgotten. Reed's voice was measured, the voice of a man who dealt only in facts. The Thorne residence was fully restored weeks ago. Insurance and personal funds covered the repairs. The younger daughter, Chloe, moved back in immediately. Clara told the shelter staff she preferred to stay and assist with the relief work. She claimed she was accustomed to making her own way. Arthur's grip tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. She chose to stay, or she was discarded. Without a direct conversation, that's impossible to verify, Reed replied. There are no police reports, no formal grievances filed. On the surface, it's a clean slate. Arthur ended the call and turned back to the manila folder. He scanned the bank records. The deposits were consistent, a rhythmic pulse of $10,000 a month, never delayed. Yet, there were no accounting statements showing where that money went. The trust documents gave Beatrice broad discretion for the ward's benefit. He had trusted that legal jargon. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city far below. He thought of Eleanor. Her laugh, her fierce independence. She had wanted to be a teacher, ignoring his offers to fund the most prestigious medical schools. She had chosen Julian, a high school coach with a steady hand and a kind heart. When the accident claimed Julian when Clara was 15, Arthur had sent a massive floral arrangement, increased the monthly stipend, and accepted Beatrice's word that the family was holding together. Now, doubt settled in his bones like a winter chill. It wasn't an accusation yet, just a mounting list of questions. Why was there no college fund? Why was her name missing from any vehicle registration? Why was she dressed in hand-me-downs? He returned to his desk and booked the first morning flight to Houston. He instructed his assistant to clear his calendar for the week, citing family business. As the car sped toward the airport, Arthur pulled up the photos on his tablet. Clara's smile in one shot was a haunting echo of Eleanor at 19. He had already missed nearly 2 decades. He needed the truth, and he needed it from her. The flight south took just over 2 hours. By the time he landed in Houston, night had taken over the city. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. Arthur checked into a quiet boutique hotel, showered, and spent a fitful night staring at the ceiling. The next morning, he rented a plain gray sedan, no driver, no luxury branding, and drove toward the coordinates Reed had provided. The route was a map of destruction, blue tarps clinging to roofs like bandages, mountains of debris at the curbs, the scream of chainsaws as workers cleared downed oaks. He parked a block from the community center and walked the rest of the way, the folder tucked firmly under his arm. The shelter was a hive of activity, with white overflow tents filling the parking lot. Volunteers in neon vests moved through the chaos. Arthur adjusted his tie, suddenly acutely aware of how his bespoke suit marked him as a stranger to this world. He stepped through the chain-link gate, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't in years. The Texas sun was already punishing, turning the asphalt into a heat trap. Blue tarps snapped in the wind, and the air was a heavy mix of smoke from a volunteer grill, and the lingering, muddy smell of the storm's aftermath. A woman in a Navy volunteer vest approached him near the entrance, her name tag reading Mrs. Maria Santos, site director. She had kind eyes framed by weary lines and a battered clipboard in hand. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, eyeing his suit with polite curiosity. Arthur cleared his throat. "I'm looking for Clara Marlowe. I believe she's volunteering here." Mrs. Santos nodded without hesitation. "She's one of our most dedicated. Follow me." She led him through a side door into the main building. The hallway was narrow, lined with towering stacks of diaper boxes and cleaning supplies. Muffled voices echoed from the gymnasium ahead, children laughing, adults coordinating in a mix of Spanish and English. The air was thick with the scent of industrial bleach and stale coffee. They emerged into a cavernous space where rows of folding tables served as distribution hubs. Families waited in patient lines while volunteers sorted through canned goods and hygiene kits. Clara stood at the far end, guiding a young mother with 2 toddlers through a selection of clothes. She was pointing out sizes, her voice soft and patient despite the visible exhaustion in her frame. Her hair was tied back, though a few dark strands had escaped to frame her face. She wore simple cargo shorts and a shelter-issued t-shirt, her sleeves rolled up as she reached for a box of formula. Arthur stopped at the edge of the room, watching her for a long time. The way she knelt to speak at eye level with the children, the gentle smile she offered the mother, it stirred something deep and painful in his chest. Finally, he forced himself to walk forward. Clara looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from focused to cautiously polite. "Excuse me," Arthur said quietly. "Are you Clara Marlowe?" She straightened, wiping her hands on her shorts. "Yes, that's me. Do I know you?" He hesitated, searching for the right words, his voice sounding thinner than he intended. "My name is Arthur Marlowe. I'm your grandfather." The words seemed to hang in the humid air between them. Clara's eyes widened but she didn't smile. Instead, she glanced around the bustling room, then nodded toward a quiet corner near the exit doors. "Let's talk over there," she said, leading the way. They stood in the shaded hallway just outside the gym. Clara crossed her arms, not out of hostility but clearly guarded. Arthur pulled out his phone and scrolled to an old photograph of Eleanor at 19, standing on a pier, laughing. Her wrist was turned just enough to reveal a small, star-shaped birthmark. "Your mother had this mark on her left wrist," he said softly. And I know you have the same one. Clara glanced down at her own wrist instinctively, then back at him. Her expression softened, though a layer of suspicion remained. No one ever told me about a birthmark, she said. Beatrice never mentioned you at all, except to say you wanted nothing to do with us after Mom died. That you couldn't stand the sight of me. Arthur felt the words like a physical blow. He kept his voice steady. I'd like to explain, if you'll let me. Perhaps over dinner tonight. There's a quiet place near my hotel. Clara studied him for a long moment. Volunteers passed by, casting curious glances at the man in the expensive suit, and the girl in the donated shirt. She shifted her weight, clearly weighing the risk. I have another shift until 6, she said finally. I can meet you at 7, but only for an hour. I have to be back here early tomorrow. Arthur nodded with profound gratitude. That's more than fair. I'll send a car for you, or I can meet you wherever you feel most comfortable. I'll find my own way, she replied firmly. Just text me the address. He gave her his number, and she typed it into a basic, cracked phone. Then, she returned to her table without another word, resuming her work as if the conversation had been nothing more than a routine inquiry. Arthur walked back to his rental car in a daze. That brief exchange had told him more than any private investigator's report ever could. Clara's guarded tone and the clinical way she spoke of Beatrice painted a picture of a profound, calculated distance. He drove to a nearby diner to wait out the afternoon, ordering a black coffee he barely touched. His mind replayed the detail of the birthmark. He had chosen it deliberately, something only family would know, something Beatrice couldn't have easily fabricated or erased. Clara's reaction confirmed she had been kept in the dark about everything. By 7 o'clock, he was seated at a corner table in a quiet steakhouse overlooking the bay. The atmosphere was understated, with white linens and soft, amber lighting. He had arrived early, leaving the manila folder in his hotel room this time. Clara appeared at the entrance exactly on time. She had changed into clean jeans and a simple blouse, practical and modest. The hostess led her to the table. Thank you for coming, Arthur said as she sat down. She nodded, accepting a glass of water from the server. I almost didn't. That photo, it made me curious. They ordered light meals, grilled snapper for him, a salad for her. The conversation started tentatively. Arthur asked about her work at the shelter. It keeps me busy, she said. After the storm hit, Beatrice told me the house repairs would take months, and that space was tight, with all the contractors coming and going. She suggested I stay here and help out, since I already knew many of the families in the area. Arthur listened intently, noting the way she phrased it. Suggested, not insisted. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a flat, weary acceptance. And Chloe? Arthur asked gently. Clara shrugged, her gaze dropping to her salad. She went back home as soon as the school year began. She has her extracurriculars, a whole new wardrobe for the term. She always calls me lazy for staying out here so long. The casual way she said it, as if being sidelined was simply the natural order of things, made Arthur's heart ache. He steered the conversation away from the present, focusing instead on the daughter he had lost. Your mother wanted to teach elementary school, he said. She spent her summers volunteering at after-school programs, even back in college. Clara's eyes lit up with a spark of genuine interest. I didn't know that. Beatrice never really talked about her. They lingered over coffee as the restaurant began to quiet down. Clara asked careful, hesitant questions about Eleanor's childhood, listening intently to stories of summer trips to the mountains and long holiday dinners. Arthur kept the tone light, sharing the kind of memories that wouldn't overwhelm her. As the hour mark approached, Clara checked her phone. I should head back. Arthur stood with her. Thank you for trusting me this far. I'd like to keep talking, if you're willing. She paused at the table, her expression unreadable. "Maybe one step at a time," she said softly. He watched her walk toward the bus stop, her figure disappearing into the warm evening air. Back in his room, Arthur sat on the balcony, looking out over the dark expanse of the Gulf. That dinner had given him more questions than answers, but there was a fragile thread of connection now. Clara hadn't run. She had listened. For tonight, that was enough. The next evening, they met again. The restaurant's large windows framed the dark water, the waves barely visible under a thin crescent moon. Arthur waited until the server had refilled their water before reaching into his briefcase. He placed a slim folder on the table and opened it to a printed summary page. "This is something I've carried with me since I arrived," he said quietly. Clara leaned forward, curious but still visibly reserved. The page showed a long column of dates stretching back years, each paired with a transfer amount, $10,000, month after month. "These are the deposits I made into a trust fund set up in your name right after your mother passed," Arthur explained. "The total has grown to well over $3 million by now. It was intended to cover everything, your education, your living costs, whatever you might need while growing up." Clara stared at the numbers, her fork forgotten in her hand. She traced one line with a trembling finger, as if testing to see if the ink was real. "I've never seen this before," she whispered. "No one ever told me there was a trust." Arthur nodded slowly, keeping his voice neutral despite the storm brewing inside him. "When your father passed and Beatrice became your legal guardian, the account allowed her to withdraw funds for reasonable expenses related to your upbringing. Housing, food, tuition, that's standard practice for a minor's trust." He didn't add an accusation, he let the facts speak. Clara's brow furrowed as she processed the scale of the figure. "So all this money, it was supposed to be for me?" "That was the only intention," Arthur replied. "I trusted the system and the people in your life to use it for your benefit." Clara sat back, folding her hands in her lap. The shock in her eyes was shifting into something far more complicated, a mixture of deep confusion and a quiet, budding hurt. Arthur pulled out his phone and dialed a contact listed as Mark Henderson, attorney. The call connected on the second ring. "Mark, it's Arthur. I'm with Clara now. I need a full forensic trace on the trust activity, withdrawals, transfers, every penny from the last 5 years at minimum. Focus on the largest transactions." Mark's voice came through clearly on the speaker, professional and calm. "I can start pulling the digital statements tonight, but a full audit will take a few days. I'll need signed authorization from you and Clara once we confirm her access." Arthur looked across the table. Clara gave a small, resolute nod. "We'll have that sorted tomorrow," Arthur said. "Keep me updated." He ended the call and slid the phone away. Silence settled over them, broken only by the distant clatter of the kitchen. Clara was the first to speak, her voice low and steady. "After Dad's accident, I was 15. Everything changed at the house. Beatrice started focusing entirely on Chloe. New clothes for her, the best schools, expensive dance lessons. I was told I needed to pitch in, to take part-time jobs at local shops to cover my own extras." Arthur listened without interrupting, his coffee cooling, untouched. "She used to say it built character," Clara continued. "Chloe picked up on it too. She'd make little comments about how I didn't need much anyway. I just figured that's how it was after losing Dad. That money was tight for everyone." She shrugged, but the motion carried the weight of years of quiet, forced acceptance. Arthur felt the full gravity of his absence settle in his chest. He had sent those deposits religiously, convinced that his money was a silent bridge that made up for his distance. "I should have asked for more updates," he said finally. "I let my own grief become an excuse to look away." "I let distance become an excuse," Arthur admitted, finally meeting her eyes. Clara's gaze was steady, searching for something in his face. "Why didn't you ever call? Or visit?" Her question was blunt, stripped of anger but heavy with a need to understand. Arthur exhaled a long, ragged breath. Grief is a corrosive thing. Losing Eleanor, it broke something fundamental in me. I buried myself in the business, telling myself that the money was my way of being there. Beatrice sent the occasional photo, a note saying you were thriving. I didn't push for more because facing the truth was harder than signing a check. He reached back into the folder and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It showed Eleanor on a wooden pier, a charcoal pencil in one hand, and a sketchpad in the other, capturing the ocean at sunset. Your mother was obsessed with the way light played on the water, he said softly. She'd sit for hours just trying to get the horizon right. She said it made her feel like she was part of something that didn't have an end. Clara took the photo, her fingers tracing her mother's concentrated expression. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I've always liked drawing horizons, she whispered. I never knew where that came from. They stayed in the booth long after the dinner rush had faded. Clara shared fragmented memories of Julian, how he used to coach her soccer games, and the way he'd patiently show her how to fix things around the house. Arthur reciprocated with stories of Eleanor's stubborn streak, recalling how she'd insisted on working 3 jobs to pay her way through college despite his fortune. As the restaurant began to empty, Clara glanced at her watch. I have to catch the last bus back to the center. Arthur signaled for the check immediately. Let me drive you. It's the least I can do. She hesitated, then gave a sharp, single nod. The drive to the relief center was quiet, the city lights reflecting off the slick, dark pavement of streets still drying from a late afternoon shower. When they pulled up to the gate, Clara paused with her hand on the door handle. This is a lot to process, she said. I need some time to think about all of it. Take all the time you need, Arthur replied. I'm not going anywhere. She nodded and stepped out, her figure disappearing into the pool of light at the entrance. Arthur watched until the door closed behind her, then drove back to his hotel, in a state of restless contemplation. In his suite, he stood by the window, staring out at the Gulf. The records on his desk were proof of his intent, but they weren't yet proof of a crime. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Mark Henderson. I have the preliminary sweep, the lawyer said. There's a pattern of large withdrawals over the last 3 years. They're all labeled as household maintenance or educational expenses for dependents. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed. How substantial? We're looking at multiple 6-figure transfers. On the surface, it looks like a guardian managing a household. But the problem is, the documentation for the tuition and the extracurriculars doesn't match Clara's history. It matches Chloe's. Keep digging, Arthur commanded. I want vendor invoices. I want to see exactly whose name is on those receipts. He ended the call, his mind spinning. The labels were clever, they sounded reasonable on paper. A guardian raising 2 children could argue that the funds benefited the entire household. But those photos of Clara sleeping on a gym floor wouldn't leave him. He decided to test the narrative himself. He dialed the home number he hadn't called in years. Beatrice answered on the 3rd ring, her voice warm and laced with surprise. Arthur. It's been ages. How on earth are you? I'm in Texas, actually, he said, his voice level. I flew down to see the storm damage for myself. How is everyone holding up? We're managing, she replied smoothly. The repairs are nearly finished. Insurance covered the bulk of it, thank goodness. And Clara? Arthur asked. Is she back home yet? There was a microscopic hesitation. She's still at the community center. You know Clara, she has such a heart for service, she insisted on staying to help. Besides, we have crews finishing the guest wing, so it's a bit of a construction zone here. She thought it was better to stay where she was needed. A younger, bright voice chirped in the background. Mom, who is that? Beatrice laughed lightly. It's your grandfather, Chloe. Say hello. Chloe took the phone, her voice bubbling with energy. Hi. Clara is totally obsessed with her charity work right now. I've been so swamped with midterms and prep school stuff, I barely see her. It sounds like you're both very busy, Arthur said, his tone carefully neutral. I'd like to stop by and see the house when it's convenient. Of course, Beatrice said quickly. Just let us know when. We'd love to have you. Arthur set the phone down. The concern in Beatrice's voice had sounded practiced, and Chloe's chatter was the picture of teenage innocence. Yet it felt like a script, rehearsed until the edges were too smooth to be real. He met Clara the following afternoon at a small coffee shop near the shelter. She arrived in fresh clothes, her hair still damp from a quick shower. He recounted the phone call word for word, watching her face. Clara stirred her iced tea, a frown deepening on her forehead. That's the story she tells everyone. That I chose to stay because I wanted to help and the house was a mess. And the repairs? Arthur pressed. Clara shrugged. They finished the main living areas weeks ago. Beatrice told me the extra work on the wings would be too noisy and dusty, and that it was better if I stayed clear until the very end. They finished the main living areas weeks ago, Clara said, her voice trailing off as she stared into her tea. Beatrice told me the dust from the renovation was bad for my lungs, and that it was better if I stayed clear until the very end. Arthur nodded, letting the weight of her words settle in the air. And Chloe's comments about your work? Clara gave a small, tired shrug. They don't surprise me. Chloe has always had the newest laptops, the best dance gear. I've spent the last 4 years making do with whatever was left over. Beatrice says it's because Chloe's activities are more specialized and cost more to maintain. I suppose I just grew used to the idea that it was fair. The defense of her guardian came out automatically, a reflex honed by years of habit. Arthur could hear the lingering loyalty in her voice, the desperate hope of a child who still wanted to believe she was part of a family that valued her. It's possible everything is being handled correctly, Arthur said, choosing his words with extreme caution. Mark is just double-checking the routine withdrawals. There are some significant charges for household maintenance and school costs. Clara looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. School costs. I've been in public school since Dad died. Chloe is the only one who goes to that private academy in the city. Arthur didn't push any further. The seed of doubt had been planted, and he knew that forcing the issue now would only cause her to retreat. They shifted the conversation to lighter topics, the families she had met at the shelter, and the small victories of the relief effort. He shared a story about Eleanor organizing a massive book drive in high school, and for a while, the tension eased. As they parted outside the shop, Clara paused, looking back at him. Thank you for not assuming the worst right away. This is a lot to wrap my head around. I'm not assuming anything yet, Arthur assured her. We'll wait for the facts to speak for themselves. She gave a small nod and walked back toward the shelter. Arthur watched her until she was out of sight, then returned to his hotel. That evening, he sat at his laptop, reviewing the preliminary summaries Mark had sent over. The educational costs matched the tuition invoices for St. Jude's Academy, an elite prep school. Chloe's name was on every single line. The household expenses included high-end kitchen renovations and the purchase of a luxury SUV registered solely in Beatrice's name. It was still circumstantial. A clever lawyer could argue these were shared benefits of a unified household. Arthur closed the laptop, his jaw set. A confrontation too soon would only give Beatrice time to build a defense or hide the paper trail. He sent a short text to Clara, "Good night. Thinking of you." She replied with a simple thumbs up. Sleep was elusive. Arthur lay awake listening to the distant hum of the city, weighing the variables of his next move. A visit to the house was inevitable, but timing was everything. He needed Clara to see the truth for herself, not just hear it from him. 2 days later, the rental sedan pulled into the circular driveway of the Thorne residence in a gated Houston suburb. The house was a pristine, 2-story stucco with fresh white paint and manicured palms swaying in the breeze. There wasn't a single sign of storm damage. Arthur parked behind Mark Henderson's discreet gray SUV. Clara sat in the back seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Mark turned from the passenger seat to look at her. "Remember, we are here to ask questions," he said firmly. "We aren't making accusations yet. We are going to let the documents do the talking." Arthur nodded. They stepped out into the heavy morning air. Clara hesitated for a heartbeat before following them, smoothing down the front of her simple cotton dress. Beatrice opened the door almost immediately, a wide, welcoming smile on her face. "Arthur, you finally made it. And Clara, honey, it's so good to have you back." She stepped forward to give Clara a brief, practiced hug before ushering them inside. The foyer opened into a sprawling living room with vaulted ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was filled with new leather furniture and expensive abstract art. Chloe appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in designer leggings and a cropped top, her phone glued to her hand. She descended with a graceful, rehearsed air. "Hi, grandfather." "Hi, sis." Arthur returned the greeting with a stiff politeness. They settled in the living room, Beatrice and Chloe on the long sofa, Arthur and Mark in the armchairs, and Clara on a side chair, sitting slightly apart from the rest. Beatrice offered coffee, which Mark accepted for everyone to keep the atmosphere civil. Once the cups were distributed, Arthur placed a thick leather folder on the glass coffee table. "Thank you for seeing us, Beatrice," he began. "I've spent the last few days going over the trust records with my attorney. There are several discrepancies I'm hoping you can clarify." Beatrice's smile didn't falter, though her eyes sharpened. "Of course. Anything I can do to help." Arthur opened the folder to a highlighted summary page. The trust one established for Clara has seen over $3 million in deposits since its inception. However, the recent withdrawals don't seem to align with her direct benefit. He slid the page across the table. Beatrice glanced at it, her expression remaining perfectly calm. "Those are standard family expenses, Arthur," she said smoothly. "Raising 2 girls in this city isn't exactly cheap. We had the roof to repair after the storm, plus the general upkeep of the home, utilities, groceries, we all shared this roof. It's all part of the same pot." Mark leaned forward, his voice professional and cool. "The line items specifically mention educational costs for dependents. Could you walk us through those?" Beatrice nodded, unfazed. "Certainly. Chloe's tuition at the academy is nearly $50,000 a year. Then there are the dance competitions, the private tutoring, it all adds up quickly." Chloe piped up from her end of the sofa, her tone bright and helpful. "And that trip to the Virgin Islands last spring was so important for our mental health. Mom said we needed to bond as a family after the stress of the hurricane season." Clara shifted in her seat, her eyes widening as she looked around the lavishly decorated room. Arthur kept his face a mask of neutral stone. Mark flipped to another page in the folder. "And this withdrawal for $70,000 listed as home renovation. The contractor invoices we recovered are specifically for a custom suite in the West Wing." Beatrice waved a hand dismissively. "That was for the entire upper floor. Clara has her room there, too." "But Clara hasn't lived here in months," Mark pointed out quietly. "And this vehicle purchase, it's registered solely in your name, Beatrice." Beatrice's smile finally began to tighten at the edges. "It's a family vehicle used for errands that benefit everyone," she snapped. "Chloe is constantly on her phone, and I'm the one doing all the driving." Chloe didn't look up from her screen. "Clara never really wanted the fancy stuff anyway," she murmured. "She's always been more basic." The word seemed to vibrate in the silence that followed. Clara's cheeks flushed a deep crimson, but she kept her gaze fixed on the coffee table. Chloe's tuition at the academy is nearly $50,000 a year, Beatrice said, her voice regaining its polished edge. Between the dance competitions and the private tutoring, the costs are staggering. Chloe looked up from her screen, her expression bright with a superficial sort of helpfulness. And that trip to the Virgin Islands last spring was incredible. Mom said we needed some real family bonding after all the stress of the hurricane season. Clara shifted in her chair, her eyes widening as the pieces of the last few years began to snap into place. Arthur remained perfectly still, his face a mask of cold, focused neutrality. Mark Henderson didn't miss a beat, he simply turned to the next section of the file. I see a withdrawal here for $70,000, listed as a home renovation, Mark noted. However, the contractor's invoices are specifically for a custom bedroom suite, and a private balcony for Chloe. Beatrice waved a hand dismissively, though the gesture was tighter than before. It was for the entire upper floor. Clara has her own space there, too. But Clara hasn't lived here in months, Mark countered softly. And this vehicle purchase, it's registered solely to you, Beatrice. Beatrice's smile finally began to fray. It's a family vehicle for errands. It benefits everyone in the household. Chloe glanced at her sister, her tone dripping with a condescending sort of pity. Clara never really wanted the fancy stuff anyway. She's always been more basic. The word hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Clara's cheeks burned, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on her hands. Arthur spoke then, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. This trust was established for one purpose, Clara's future. Texas law allows a guardian reasonable expenses for a ward's care, but the vast majority of these funds must benefit the named beneficiary. These records show almost nothing spent on Clara. No college fund, no personal savings, not even a reliable car. Beatrice straightened her posture, her eyes flashing with a sudden, defensive fire. I've raised her since she was a child. I provided a roof, food, and clothing. That is benefit enough. The money kept this household running. Mark produced another stack of papers, invoices for European tours, designer jewelry, and the installation of a heated infinity pool. None of these records mention Clara. In fact, she was excluded from every single one of these trips. Beatrice's composure finally cracked. Bank errors happen, she stammered. Or perhaps the accountants mislabeled the files. Chloe looked up from her phone, finally sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. Mom did everything for both of us, she insisted. Clara just didn't want the same things I did. She never complained about not having new clothes. Clara looked up then, her voice surprisingly steady. I didn't complain because I thought we were struggling. I thought we couldn't afford it. Beatrice shot her a sharp, silencing glance. We managed just fine, Clara. Arthur's voice dropped to a dangerous, low rumble. Where has the $3 million gone, Beatrice? The question landed with the weight of a physical blow. Beatrice's eyes darted between the three men, her breathing becoming shallow. It went into raising my family. She cried, her voice rising in a sharp crescendo. Eleanor had everything handed to her on a silver platter, wealthy parents, a perfect husband. When she died, there was suddenly all this money for her child while I was the one doing the actual work. I had to make it work for everyone. Chloe frowned, her voice small. Mom. Why should only one child get every advantage? Beatrice continued, the words tumbling out in a bitter torrent. Chloe deserved those opportunities too. Mark closed the folder with a definitive thud. These patterns suggest a calculated, intentional diversion of funds. This isn't just a misunderstanding, Beatrice. This is embezzlement. Beatrice stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. You're twisting the truth. I'm the one who stayed. I'm the one who sacrificed. Arthur looked at Clara, who met his gaze with a quiet, newfound resolve. Mark stepped into the foyer and made a brief, quiet call. Uniformed officers arrived within minutes, having been stationed nearby in anticipation of the forensic findings. Beatrice's protests turned into frantic exclamations as they explained the arrest process. "You can't do this. Not in my home," she screamed. Chloe dropped her phone, her eyes wide with genuine terror. "Mom? What's happening?" Beatrice turned to her daughter, her face finally crumpling. "It's a mistake, baby. Just call the lawyer." The officers cuffed Beatrice with a firm, professional efficiency. She went suddenly silent, staring at the floor as they led her out to the waiting patrol car. Chloe followed them to the doorway, watching the flashing lights with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Clara remained in her chair, her breathing measured and deep. Arthur placed a steady hand on her shoulder. The Harris County Criminal Courthouse became a second home over the following months. The proceedings were grueling as Beatrice's defense team fought every bank record and argued that the withdrawals fell under the umbrella of guardian discretion. Arthur and Clara attended every session, sitting quietly behind the prosecution. Mark Henderson worked closely with the district attorney, presenting the evidence with a clinical, undeniable precision. The opening statements set a grim tone, outlining a systematic pillaging of a child's future to fund a life of suburban luxury for a guardian and her favored daughter. The defense tried to claim the imbalance was unintentional, but the testimony of the forensic accountants was devastating. They projected the transfer logs onto a large screen, showing a clear path from Arthur's deposits to private school tuitions and luxury vendors, none of which were associated with Clara. The name Chloe Thorne appeared on nearly every significant invoice. Beatrice sat at the defense table, her expression a mask of fading elegance. Chloe attended several days of the trial, dressed conservatively, though she seemed lost without the shield of her former life. When Chloe was eventually called to the stand, her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mom always made sure we were taken care of," she whispered. "She treated us the same." The prosecutor was gentle but relentless. He introduced text messages recovered from Chloe's phone, where she had mocked Clara's charity bin style, while bragging to friends about her own designer bags. Chloe looked from her mother to the jury, the realization of the situation finally sinking in. "I guess Mom bought more for me because I asked for it," she admitted. "I didn't think it was a crime." The admission hung heavily in the silent courtroom. Clara took the stand the following week. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't cry. She simply spoke the truth of a life spent in the shadows of her own inheritance. "I was told to work part-time to pay for my own shoes," she said. "I took the bus while new cars were bought for the house. I was told it was about character. I didn't know it was about theft." Beatrice sat perfectly upright, a study in forced dignity, while Chloe was led to the stand. The younger girl's voice was barely a whisper when she spoke of their home life, describing it as a place of equality and care. But the prosecution was ready. Subpoenaed records from Chloe's own phone were projected for the jury to see. They were a digital trail of arrogance, brags about designer collections intermingled with disparaging remarks about Clara's hand-me-down life. Chloe glanced from her mother to the jury, her face pale. "I guess Mom bought more for me because I asked for it," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I didn't think it was wrong." The admission rippled through the silent courtroom. Beatrice's attorney jumped to his feet with an objection, but the judge overruled him. The damage was done. Clara took the stand the following week. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back in a neat, low bun. Her voice remained even, stripped of any theatricality. "I received the basics," she told the court. "Food, a room, public school. But the trust was meant for more than survival. I've worked part-time jobs since I was 16 to cover my own extras, while my sister had private tutors and custom-built suites. I took the bus while new cars were parked in our driveway. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The jury watched her steady delivery, the quiet strength of a woman who had been forced to raise herself. Arthur took the stand briefly to confirm the trust's original intent, solely for Clara's security. He acknowledged the broad powers he had granted Beatrice, but stated clearly that his expectation was the primary benefit of his granddaughter. Beatrice testified last. She maintained that the fund had sustained the entire family unit, insisting that any disparity in spending simply reflected the different interests of the two girls. I loved them both, she claimed, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. The money was used to provide stability. The cross-examination was brutal. When shown receipts for jewelry and luxury vacations that pointedly excluded Clara, Beatrice blamed accounting errors or claimed they were gifts from unnamed sources. Her composure didn't just crack, it shattered. The closing arguments summarized months of systematic theft. The prosecutor emphasized the pattern of intentional choices, favoring one child with luxury while the beneficiary received the bare minimum. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the atmosphere in the room was electric. We find the defendant guilty on all counts of embezzlement and fraud. Beatrice showed no outward reaction, her face a mask of stone. In the gallery, Chloe buried her face in her hands. The sentencing took place weeks later. The judge reviewed the impact statements, including a letter from Clara that focused on lost time and broken trust rather than bitterness. 12 years in a federal facility, the judge announced. And full restitution is ordered. All assets traceable to the diverted funds, including the residence and vehicles, will be seized and liquidated to restore the trust. Chloe, being a minor during the bulk of the crimes, faced no charges, but her life of privilege was over. With the family home seized, court services arranged for her to live with a maternal aunt in a small, dusty town in Oklahoma, a modest apartment far from the manicured lawns of her youth. Arthur and Clara walked out of the courthouse into the blinding Texas sunlight. Reporters waited at the steps, but Mark Henderson steered them toward a waiting car. Inside, Clara stared out at the passing skyline. It's over. Arthur nodded, reaching over to squeeze her hand. The legal part? Yes. I don't feel like I won, she said quietly. I just feel empty. That's normal, Clara. Healing takes a lot longer than a trial. They flew back to Colorado that evening. The seized assets would eventually rebuild the trust, but the money felt secondary now. Beatrice began her sentence, and Chloe started over in a public school, working a shift at a local diner to help her aunt with the bills. Clara stepped into Arthur's Denver penthouse for the first time, her small suitcase looking like an intruder on the polished marble floors. The panoramic views of the Rockies were breathtaking, but she hesitated in the foyer. I'm not ready for all this space, she whispered. Could I start in a smaller room? Maybe the guest suite off the library. Arthur understood immediately. He prepared a quiet corner room for her, furnished simply and comfortably. Clara unpacked slowly, placing her few belongings in the drawers. The quiet luxury still felt like a borrowed life. She enrolled in a social work program at a local university, starting with introductory courses that resonated with her own experiences. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing theories on family dynamics and recovery. Arthur never pushed her. They shared quiet evening meals prepared by his housekeeper, and he spoke of Eleanor often. He told her how her mother had organized food drives as a teenager, believing that small acts of kindness were the only way to rebuild trust in a broken world. I should have seen the signs, Arthur admitted one night over tea. I trusted the paperwork because I was too afraid to face the people. It was a coward's mistake. Clara stirred her cup, looking at him with a soft, tired smile. We both trusted too easily, Arthur. Together they decided to channel the recovered funds into something that mattered. With Mark's help, they established the Eleanor Marlowe Foundation. Its mission was narrow and focused, providing emergency housing grants, and mentorship for young adults displaced by natural disasters or family crises. Clara spent her evenings reviewing applications, matching needs with resources. For the first time, the money didn't feel like a burden or a secret, it felt like a tool. She was no longer just a survivor of a stolen inheritance, she was the architect of someone else's second chance. In the quiet of the mountains, she finally began to find the horizon her mother had spent so many years trying to capture. The foundation's focus remained disciplined, providing emergency housing grants and intensive mentoring for young adults uprooted by natural disasters. The inaugural awards were funneled back toward the Texas coast, where families were still wrestling with the long aftermath of the hurricane. Applications arrived in a steady stream, and Clara spent her evenings sifting through them, matching desperate needs with the foundation's resources. Seeing the tangible impact of her work gave her a sense of purpose that the old bank statements never could. One Tuesday afternoon, a plain cream envelope arrived via Mark Henderson's office. Inside was a single page of notebook paper, covered in Chloe's looped, hurried handwriting. "I've had a lot of time to sit with my thoughts lately," the letter began. "I knew Mom favored me, and I was selfish enough never to question it. The things I said to you, calling you basic, laughing at your clothes, they were cruel. I'm sorry, Clara. I wish I could reach back and change it all." Clara read the letter twice in the stillness of her room. The words were laced with a raw sort of regret, but the weight of years spent on the periphery of her own home was a heavy counterweight. She folded the paper and tucked it into the back of a desk drawer. She didn't write back, and she didn't throw it away. She simply chose not to engage. She made no effort to contact Beatrice or Chloe again. No visits were scheduled, no updates were sought. Beatrice was serving her sentence in a minimum security federal facility, a place defined by a rigid, gray routine. The social circles she had once cultivated so carefully had long since closed ranks to protect their own reputations, leaving her name a whispered warning in the suburbs of Houston. In Oklahoma, Chloe was navigating a jarringly different reality. Living with their aunt in a cramped, two-bedroom apartment, she attended the local public high school and worked long shifts at a roadside diner. The transition from designer labels to a polyester waitress uniform had been brutal, but she endured it without the public tantrums many had predicted. Clara's own life found a steady, healing rhythm. Morning lectures were followed by afternoon shifts at a Denver crisis center, and her evenings were dedicated to the foundation's files. Arthur joined her for board meetings when his health allowed, offering the kind of quiet, strategic guidance he had once reserved for his real estate empire. The trust between them grew in small, daily increments. Eventually, she felt ready to move from the small guest room into the larger suite. They took long walks through the city's parks, discussing everything from classic literature to the nuances of social policy. Arthur began to fill in the gaps of her history, sharing old albums that showed Eleanor at her own graduation, beaming as she held a newborn Clara just days before the world came apart. There were nights, however, when the old shadows returned, moments when she wondered if she would ever truly stop feeling like the invisible girl. Therapy sessions provided a space to unpack those layers. "I'm learning that boundaries aren't an act of selfishness," she told Arthur after a particularly grueling appointment. "Choosing not to look back doesn't mean I'm holding on to a grudge. It means I'm protecting the peace I've worked so hard to find." Arthur listened without a hint of judgment. Under their stewardship, the foundation continued to expand, launching a secondary initiative for tutoring programs aimed at displaced teenagers. Clara even found the courage to speak at a small donor gala, her voice unwavering as she explained why a stable home mattered more than the money used to build it. One crisp autumn evening, Clara stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the city lights of Denver sparkling like diamonds below. "Money can vanish into thin air," she said softly to the night. "And trust can be shattered by the very people sworn to protect it. But the choice to keep moving, to turn your own wreckage into a bridge for someone else, that's something no one can take away." She looked out toward the dark, jagged silhouette of the mountains. "Some wounds never heal entirely," she continued. "They leave ridges of scar tissue that change the landscape of a person. Those scars are just proof that we survived. And surviving isn't the end of the story. It's just the moment you finally get to decide who you're going to be. Arthur joined her at the railing, a silent, steady companion. Clara leaned against the cold metal, breathing in the thin, sharp air. The trust fund had been restored through the long process of seizure and restitution, but its original importance had faded into the background. What mattered now were the quiet mornings, the honest conversations with the only family she had left, and the hard-won knowledge that her worth was no longer a variable subject to someone else's greed. She turned and walked back inside, the heavy glass door sliding shut with a soft, final click.